Hello and welcome to our March. It's March. Nonfiction book club. Thank you guys for joining us today as we talk about this book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. The YouTube link just went live and I suddenly heard my own voice in my head and I was like, no, I don't want that. But first, introduction to Nonfiction Book Club. I am Deboki. I'm a science writer and I talk about science on YouTube in different capacities. And usually, so we alternate back and forth. For those of you who are new to Nonfiction Book Club, welcome. We've had people like signing up for our newsletter and stuff, which is very exciting. So I feel like new people have been finding us. The way that this has been working is we've been going back and forth between our channels. And usually, technically, I usually pick more of a sciencey kind of read, physical sciencey kind of read. Sometimes they straddle both of our worlds. And I'll let Nicole talk more about herself and what she kind of usually picks, because this book is going to end up straddling a lot of both of our worlds. So
yes, indeed. Hi, I'm Nicole Sweeney. I also do things on YouTube. My background is in sociology and communications, so I am typically picking social science books. My next pick is also kind of a weird one, but yeah, that's it. That's all you need to know about me.
Yeah. we're gonna unpeel all like any mushroom related deep thoughts that impacted us over the course of our lives with this book. I don't know if you have any mushroom attachment, but this made me think about mushrooms a lot. No.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that there's a lot to say about mushrooms, at least in the context of this book. And so this book was published in 2015. The author is Anna Tsing, and she's an anthropologist, which I didn't fully process when I picked this book, but I know of anthropology, but I am not a person who can really speak to anthropology and define the field, but I know that she is an anthropologist, so I assume this is an anthropology book. But basically its focus is on the matsutake mushroom, which is this particular mushroom that in Japan at least is often given as a gift, so it's very prized in this way because people want to give it to people, but just from a nature standpoint, it has these very, very specific growth requirements. It's a mushroom. It has these very specific symbiotic relationships with certain species of trees. And so it's very particular about what kind of environments it's going to live in, how it's going to grow. So it's not something that you can actually just make. You can't just farm this mushroom. And in Japan, in particular, where yes, it is a popular gift, but because of these tree-infecting nematodes, the production had gone down a lot, or not production, but the ability to find these matsutake had gone down a lot. And so there have been other places that have kind of taken up the call of matsutake picking, in particular in Oregon, where it's become this whole thing that brings people together from different cultures and perspectives, and puts them really in this really interesting supply chain that Tsing is exploring in this book. And that's she's exploring this supply chain, but she's exploring a lot of things. She's examining the relationships that these different pickers have to picking, how they came to it, how they navigate it, how it fits into their lives and histories. She's also examining the mushroom itself as a good. She's tracing it as it there's this really extended section that I'm sure we'll talk about, where she's tracing the mushroom as it starts out as what she defines as a gift, then becomes this capitalist commodity, then goes back to gift again. She also does a lot of stuff looking at industrial forest ruins, forestry policy, ecology, scientific communities. So it's all of this stuff just through the lens of this one mushroom that I had not heard about until I heard about this book, which is very interesting. But it's also a lot. But it's a lot in a way that I'm excited about, because like I said, this is one of those books that kind of encompasses what is usually a thing that we think of as two different sides of Nonfiction Book Club, the social science side and also the physical science side. And so I think Yeah, I'm curious how this book felt to you, like in that context of like the social sciences side, because I am like Nonfiction Book Club is me learning about social science writing. So
and vice versa. Yes. Yes. As a general rule, picking up a lot of like sciencey books that I never would have picked up, and like this is interesting too because it absolutely falls under the heading of things that like this seemed interesting, but also I never in a million years would have chosen to read this book myself. But then I started reading it and I was like, oh, this actually kind of feels like it should have been my pick. It feels like this goes in the other place. It's funny because I said something to this along these lines at the beginning of our surveillance capitalism episode that like I was surprised by the amount of social theory. And then I'm like, capitalism's on the cover of the book, Nicole. What did you think? It says it right there. So maybe the third time that we pick a book that mentions capitalism on the cover of the book, I will know what to expect. So that's on me. That's not on the book. So mostly I was just like surprised because I was like, okay, we're talking about mushrooms and I'm going to learn about, I don't know, like the science. I know nothing about mushrooms. So truly, I don't know, but I was excited that these mushrooms were going to be connected to capitalism in some kind of way. I hate to start with this question of how I felt about the book as a social science book because the thing that like I want to come back around to, and the thing I want to like preface my answer with is that I generally liked this book, but I liked this book because I love her concept so much. Like I think the project of this book is so interesting. The writing of this book annoyed me so much for reasons that are not really about this author, but it's like conventions of social science writing that I don't like, that this book is doing a lot of, where a lot of the
Oh no. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna figure out where Nicole went. Hold on a second, everyone. Sorry for our temporary pause. Okay. I guess while I wait to figure out with Nicole, is this my problem? Okay, so Nicole can hear me. So I'm gonna talk a little bit, I guess, while I wait for Nicole. But I'm trying to figure out what to fill the space with while we debug the entire internet. Maybe while we're waiting for Nicole, if any of you guys have read the book and you want to start, if you want to tell me a little bit about how you guys felt about it, that would be awesome. Because I'm really curious. Like I said, I am like super new to this, like to reading social sciences. So some of the stuff that Nicole was quickly alluding to, we had like chatted about quickly ahead of time in terms of like kind of conventions of social science writing. You know, Robin, you mentioned that Anna was your thesis mentor, which is super cool. And so I am familiar with conventions of like academic kind of physical sciences writing, which is super different from reading a lot of these social science stuff. Oh, hello, there's Nicole.
Hi, my camera battery died. So
got it.
My nice camera. You're noticing that I am coming to you with fewer pixels now. That is why.
Got it.
It's fine.
That is luckily that's an easy to deal with situation.
Yes. I just Yeah, I hadn't been plugging it in. I've been using it as a webcam for so long, and at some point I like took it down to use it as like a vlogging camera. And when I restored it to its spot behind me, I didn't plug it back in. So every time I've used it as a webcam, it's just I've been draining and draining and draining the battery. And now it was like, no, Nicole, we're done. I'm tired.
There's a finite limit to this battery.
I want to go to bed now. And that's fair. That's fair, little camera. You've done so much for me. Anyway.
Yeah. So while I was improving, what was it? Okay. So I was saying that for me, this is like, again, for me, like part of my newfound introduction to the world of like academic social sciences, literature. And like, you had that feeling in the beginning of like, oh, maybe this should have been your book. I definitely like while reading the beginning, I was like, oh no, well, I don't know how to lead this discussion because there's a lot of like commodities and capitalism and like chains and like that like kind of social theory framework that I can recite and like can talk about, but like I was like, oh shit, like I don't know if I'm the one to lead this discussion. But then we got to the second half of the book where she talks a lot about like the ecology stuff, and especially what I really loved was like the discussion of like scientific communities and like policy and like how all of those things interact with this. And that was like super fun for me because I was like, this is such a cool intersection to me of these different worlds that like, and that's part of the thing she talks about like kind of loosely. And like I have my quibbles with the way that she frames it, which we'll get to when we quibble, but like the sort of like disconnect in a lot of scientific communities and between a lot of different fields. And she's also talking a lot about like international disconnect. Like I thought it was really interesting how she talked about the difference in how like these Japanese scientists were talking about how they need to like manage their forests versus how we talk about it in a lot of like in particular, I think she's talking about like the forestry community in the US, like, and that's speaking very broadly, but like the general focus is more about like getting humans to interact less with the trees. And then in these Japanese communities, more about like interacting more with the trees. And that relates to like all of these other concepts that she talks about in terms of like contamination and like, which is a phrase she uses to kind of like describe the ways that we interact with things and they change. Like with interaction, it's not just the interaction itself, it's like this change that is created by contamination. And contamination is to me is such a loaded word because it like sounds so negative. From my experience in the lab, when your samples get contaminated, that's not a good thing. You don't want that. And so I liked how this kind of drew on that and like especially like took a lot of these concepts and made it less about like good versus bad and more about like okay, well what is this world? Like what does this world look like through the mushroom? Which I just really enjoyed.
The contamination themes were also super interesting because it's like it's very rooted in on both sides of the equation, like the social science aspects of it and like the science aspects of it. Like part of why she keeps sort of circling back to that has to do with like how things exist in the real world too, and like the ways in which we're constantly trying to like ignore that and like focus on okay, what's the uncontaminated version of this thing? And it's like okay, but like here's what like really happens. That I thought was I enjoyed that aspect of this.
Yeah, and she like explores that through like so many different angles too, of both like the human side and that science side. Like she talks about in the context of like these pickers and like how are their histories are shaping them and like shaping their particular like view of how they've like come to be where they are, how that interacts like or how that shapes their interaction with the forest, like all of these different pieces, kind of like how they all come together. Which I think hits on this like theme that we always like end up coming around to in Nonfiction Book Club, which is like the importance of systems, like of understanding things at a system level. She calls them assemblages. It's like basically the collection of things, whether you're talking about ecology or society, but just like everything. You can't just understand through any one individual component. You have to like understand the whole thing together.
Like one of the first times she uses the word, she describes it as being like like we think in terms of communities, but what about like stuff where it's not at quite a community, like it's not quite fair to call it that because like they're not necessarily like active connecting with the kind of intentionality that a community implies, but it's more that they're all just kind of there in the same place.
Yeah.
And so like what does it mean that these whatever people, objects are occupying that same space, and like what are the implications of that. That I also, it was really interesting.
Yeah, and that like got me back to that sort of like notion of good versus bad, and particularly like human interaction with nature, because like my default, just like from a cynical place, is just to be like human bad. Like we are bad. We are not good.
Obviously, we're talking about nature. Yeah. We're the villains. We're the villains in a nature story. Like that.
Yeah. And so like, but it was just like a nice way to like kind of re-engage with the idea of like we are still like part of nature. Like we have like evolved in a world like that has been built around us, not around us, but like around all of us, like interacting with each other. And like you're saying, like it's not like a community, like we're not all like geared towards a goal together. We're not like acting as a community, but there is like a natural like set of interactions that's arising from all of us, and like how we interact. It like made me think of nature like weirdly differently, which is not a thing that I was like expecting from this book, in terms of just like thinking of all of these interactions as like more incidental, rather than somehow like directed is the wrong word, especially if we're talking about evolution, because directed evolution has like a very specific meaning. But there's like, and this is like a thing that comes up in how we talk about evolution, where like it's so easy to slip into the language of like something evolved to do this, and like that's not really like the way evolution, like evolution is not like this like thing on high that's like, okay, we're gonna do this next.
Goal oriented.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like, oh, things happened and like this is how things have responded. And I think that was like, there's especially like when we're like it was interesting tracing that in the biology stuff, and also connecting it to stuff like in the history, like she's going through these histories of these supply chains, and like people's histories and like how they ended up in America. Like all of these things are like it like emphasized that sense of like things being incidental but consequential, like where they like build together in that way.
Yes. It's funny you mentioned at the top though, like that the words and phrases that you were rattling off as like the reasons that you didn't feel qualified to lead this discussion were all economics words. And I know that like as you're like getting introduced to like the fuzziness of social sciences, I'm also not the person to lead that conversation. Nathan, we gotta like hit him up, be like, hey, can you come lead our book club discussion?
So for the audience, I'm conveniently married to an economist. There have been times that I have like been reading books for Nonfiction book club and like raised my head to be like, hey, Nathan, what does this mean? And we had this conversation like with surveillance capitalism, because like when we talk about neoliberal economics, that is to him like a very frustrating phrase, because it like gets used in various twittery kind of ways. And so when I was just like reading passages to him from surveillance capitalism in the beginning, like by the end of surveillance capitalism, I was like, oh, okay, I'm on board with what she was doing. But in the beginning, when I was like getting acquainted with this language, like I was trying to use him to understand what was going on. He's like, I don't think this means anything. And then like I was like, no, she means something. Don't worry, I get it now. But there were definitely phrases here, like she brings up like neoclassical economics, and he's like, no, that has a thing. Like I was worried at first. I like turned to him and was like, I don't know if this means something. He's like, yes, it means something. Like she's actually using this in a meaningful way. And I feel like that, like, that's why I like the discussion so much of the supply chain, because one of the questions I had early on, so she's talking about the mushroom going from Oregon to Japan, and she's talking about it as part of this huge supply chain and like how this relates to capitalism. And I was having a really hard time at first. Like I had this initial question that I wrote in the book that was just like, how is this not just trade? Like how is it not just like we have a mushroom getting picked in Oregon and now it's being traded over to these buyers in Japan? Like how is, like, I don't understand what is specifically interesting or compelling about this situation, but the way that she broke it down in terms of like how it's being kind of like transferred along the supply chain was really like, okay, I understand this specific example and like how it's going from picking to commodity, and like the idea of alienation, which is like a thing that came up, I think, in our surveillance capitalism discussion. And I feel like I'm seeing that word more and more now, and I'm starting to be like, oh, when I see the word alienation, like I know something is important happening. But seeing like in this context of the supply chain, and then how she like relates this specific journey of the matsutake mushroom from Oregon to Japan to the history of how supply chains like have become a part of like Japanese business in particular, based on like its history, and connecting it to a lot of like economic issues related to like World War II and other things. And she like traces that to like specific businesses and stuff that for me was like, oh, like I am piecing together what we're talking about when we talk about supply chains in capitalism, which is, I really like, that's one of the things when I think about like the specificity of like focusing on this mushroom. I was like, like this example helped me understand this thing that I see people talk about. And I just am always like, I don't know.
Yes. It just feels like a very like abstract concept, but like, yes, picking something very specific to follow it. I mean, yes, if you're talking about supply chains, like that is absolutely 100% like the best way to explain. You have to like pick an object and really follow it. Actually, a couple of years ago, Planet Money did a really delightful project with a T-shirt that was a series of podcast episodes, and there was a website for it. I found it like I listened to that podcast series like, I don't know, like a week after they closed the store to buy the shirt. And it was like so devastating. Like I went to them, I was like, oh, I want to buy the shirt too. Alas.
I have like the exact reference. Like I noted that Planet Money episode in my notes too. I feel very excited that we both were like, Planet Money.
Yes.
Yeah. And it like does like such a great similar thing too of like narrowing on the specifics, and also like they talk to the different workers at different stages. Like I always remember they talk to like these Bangladeshi workers like putting the t-shirts together, but they also like talk to like crates and stuff. Like there's all of these different elements where you're like, yes. This is how you like emphasize the weird journey that all of our goods take to get to us.
Yes. The massive journey. You mentioned also the alienation thing, which yes, that was like a big thing that jumped out at me, because it's something that like is discussed in. It's sort of like reframed, and so like you have kind of the initial ideas about like being alienated from your labor, like the Marx sort of sense of it, but then surveillance capitalism, the scope of that was so massive, but like the if I recall correctly, her framing of alienation was more about like being alienated from our own like a sense of self and like a sense of like control over our own futures, because our futures were being sort of like algorithmically determined, or are whatever. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. I don't need to spiral again here on the stream, but here she describes the mushroom has to be mushroom and like the pickers, that whatever the capitalist intervention, if you will, into this process is about alienating people and things from their life worlds in order to become exchange objects. But the mushroom is interesting because of the way it's sort of like in like the trajectory that she is carving out for it. It sort of weaves back and forth from those modes of existing, So like, you know, it starts out, you know, in the ground, that's in its original sort of life world, but then there are ways in which on its journey to becoming a commodity, it also becomes integrated into the life worlds of the pickers and of like various people along the chain. And like that was definitely one of those things that like you really had to go with like sit with her for like the length of the journey to really understand what she was talking about there and like why it was meaningfully different. Like what was meaningfully different between on both sides of that, and like her case for why it was actually sort of moving back and forth.
Yeah, and a lot of that journey, like especially understanding it sort of initially in relation to the pickers, and it's sort of like I'm very oversimplifying it, but like it starting out as this notion of more of a gift than a commodity is also related a lot to this notion that she's exploring of like freedom and like what it means to the pickers themselves, and like how they are using this path, this like this matsutake picking path, which is like they're not like employed, they're and like many of them are actually like specifically evading employment. They are still making money, but they're like it's almost more of like a gig economy thing. At least that's how I read it, where it's very much like they just want to be independent, going off, picking some mushrooms, and then at the end of the day getting paid for it in a particular way, and even down to how that payment works. This is like I turned to Nathan again because she talks about this particular auction method, which is like what he works on, and I was like, I read the paragraph, and he's like, "Oh yeah, this is this kind of auction," and I was like, "Okay, sure, great account of it all." And I was like, "What does that mean for freedom?" But like in the context of this book, like she is relating it to specific notions of like how the pickers and then like the buyers are like using this particular like I don't know, this particular culture that in like environment to like have a certain sense of freedom down to how they sell their mushroom and how they auction it off and stuff like that. And that like really corresponds then to how like this mushroom starts out like in almost like I think she's like not trying to like romanticize it, but like in my head, it feels very romantic. This notion of the mushroom is like freedom thing because it's just like you're in the forest and you go and pick it and no one's your boss except yourself. Like I think that is sort of like kind of the element to it, but I don't think she overgeneralizes it in part because she knows at least, or she's telling us that like to these different pickers, depending on their background, that relationship to their notion of freedom actually changes. Like there's a lot of like Vietnam vets there, and like they have one notion of freedom that's like correlated to a certain like sense of masculinity, but then there are like refugees from a lot of different Southeast countries, but like depending on which country and which group you're talking to, their relationship to the forest and like this picking is also very different from one another, which is a thing I love because I love when people like break apart and dissect Asian American history and like a lot of like the very different origins that there are to it. Yeah, it's just like very, very complicated, but still somehow very parallel.
That there's a section where it was definitely one of the parts where it felt like we had wandered away from the mushroom. I always see this periodically, like where she would wander away, yeah. And always like bring it back. But one of the sort of detours I did along those lines I found super, super interesting, but where she was talking about like the ways in which assimilation and like ideas about assimilation impacted different Asian American communities, and like specifically focusing on like Japanese internment versus like refugee status, and like how those two things had very different consequences for the way that communities, in a general sense, tended to situate themselves vis-a-vis their Americanness, like what that meant.
Yeah, she talks about this and she's talking about this also through her own personal experience as a Chinese American, but who's like she felt like her story was different from many other Chinese Americans that she had presumably knew, in terms of where she felt like because her mom had come at a certain time, like I think like around when like communism in China like started rising, and like Cold War like in the US and Russia, like all of that stuff was like shaping these very anti-communist attitudes. Like she had felt very strongly influenced to be like to become more American, basically. Like and
coercive assimilation is how she describes it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And like, so that differs from like other immigrant communities. And I just really enjoyed that because I feel like the narrative of like Asian Americanness in the US is so dominated by like those of us who come from a more privileged Asian American background, usually more like upper middle class. And that's related to a lot of like other Asian American history things and like who got visas and when. Like it's like like it's actually like much more diverse than people like understand. And like I really liked how she she broke that down in the context of like the matsutake mushroom, and how even within this one mushroom, where it's like so easy as an outsider to overgeneralize, where you're like, oh, there's just like Asian people picking. She's saying like, no, there are very specific communities and they have a very different relationship to what they're doing here based on like histories that, even like though they might seem similar, are actually very different in how they've impacted the people and like that are like part of them.
Right. Yeah. Every time she just like she returns to like the camps, she makes a point of being like, and like this community of people will generally be in this part of the camp, and this community will be in this part, and is very sort of deliberate about those distinctions in a way that I thought was like very interesting. And like again, it was part of this larger project of like using the mushroom to tell this very like large story. And like intertwining the tiny story of the mushroom with a lot of like really, really big stories about like people and ecosystems. And again, I find the project of this book so interesting. Like I think that this book has the most compelling project of anything that we have read so far for a nonfiction book club. It's not my favorite book that we have read for Nonfiction Book Club, but I think that her like the thing that she set out to do, hands down, is the most interesting to me of everything that we have read.
Yeah, I like fully did not expect this book to go in so many different directions, and I feel like the extent to which I like have any like critical statements, it's also sort of just like I almost feel like I just need more time with the book. Like there are definitely some things where sometimes with nonfiction I have the hard time of like differentiating between like what is my fault and what is the book's fault. I mean, I have that problem with every book, but like with nonfiction where it's particularly about like, do I understand it? Like there are times where it's like, and this is like where the social science-ness of it all comes along too, because I think, and this was like a thing that I had with surveillance capitalism, where it took me a while to understand just like the language of the book, where it's just like, this is not like a text that I feel like I understand fully, just like how the language of it is spoken, right? And with this, it was hard for me to tell, like, is this just very social science-y kind of writing, or is it just like there are sentences in this book that I read multiple times and just like I still don't understand quite what they were saying, but like I don't know if that's me or the book. Because overall, like I clearly understood things in the book, but there are these moments where I just felt very like, what took me a long time to get through this book were just these sentences that to me felt like they did not need to be so difficult to ascertain. But at the same time, I don't know what they're trying to say. So I'm like, I don't know how to simplify this sentence.
I think it's both. Like one, that a lot of what she is doing is sort of like general conventions of social science writing, which is part of why like I sort of go back and forth on like how fair it feels to be like hard on this book for this thing that I did not like, because it's not a her thing. It is a like social science writing thing more broadly. But also I think that like there are places where, again, like surveillance capitalism, I would defend it. Like I would defend the how like the density of that. Like I think that it ultimately does come around to having a point in a way that a lot of this did not need to be that way. Like I don't know, like things that I'm like, yes, I understood this. I understood the point that you were making, and I just feel like you went about it in like a needlessly confusing way. I mentioned this on a previous nonfiction book club, but that like in my very first semester of grad school, one of our professors was basically like, when you are reading this, just keep going. Like if you get a sentence that you're like, what the fuck, don't stop. Just keep going. Just keep, don't let that trip you up, or you will never get done with all the reading that you have to do. And then sure enough, yes, like it was just so often the case, and not always. And this is the thing too, like it doesn't, like these are like the conventions of this writing.
Yeah.
But sometimes people don't do it. And those people, I like them better. They're my favorite people. But this book was also very much a lot of that, where it was just like, I'm going to keep going, like just proceed ahead. It's one of the main reasons that I find it so helpful to to like be doing both the audiobook and the physical copy for me personally. Like it's a little bit of an ADHD thing, I guess, but it's also that thing of like the audio to force me to keep going when my brain is like, what? No,
that makes sense.
We're not doing that. We are going to proceed, and you will get the gist of the thing without unpacking that very specific, overly wordy sentence that absolutely could have been written in a more intelligible way. But here we are.
What you're saying about your grad student, your grad teacher, like kind of like just made me think of like the point of like seminar classes in general, for at least for like life sciences stuff, where like so much like the whole point of it is just like you learn how to read the paper, like in science academic science writing, like there is a very specific structure. Find it deeply annoying. I hate reading it, but it also like I've started appreciating it more now, especially like for work where it's like I don't want to have to like read. Like I love reading old papers, actually. Like I love it. They are the best. Like they are written just so like casually. People are like, I walked down to the park, I traveled down the street, I like crossed here, then went to this one pond, collected the water. Like I love that stuff. At the same time, I've definitely come to appreciate the papers that are out today where it's just like I just know where in the paper I need to go to like find what it is I'm looking for. Like I'm like, okay, I think it's terrible writing, but I like understand the structure of it. And like, but also it took me a lot of time to like understand how to read that structure. And it's just like such a weird thing with academic writing where you're like, it feels faster once you know it, but then like you have to put so much time into knowing it. And I sometimes I'm just like, what is the point? Like, I don't.
It's a very a very gatekeepy thing about academic writing and structures and stuff. The thing is, in terms of what is the point, I think that part of what is going on in social science writing, like and part of like why you see it is a way in which it is sort of adjacent to a lot of like philosophical writing, and like the further out in the social sciences you get, like the further away from that, like I suspect that like economics papers probably have a lot less relationship to this as you're getting further away from that kind of thing. Whereas like, so in grad school was my major was communications, and so that stuff did live a lot closer to that. Where there was less like research and more like building an argument about the way that society works. And so in that space, being like, you do have to get like really particular about your words and like what words mean, even though we think we all know what a word means. Actually, the word is complicated. And now I'm going to sit here and spend 15 pages problematizing this word. And I'm going to describe it as problematizing also.
Yeah.
And so I think that's my guess.
Yeah.
As somebody who didn't, who like I don't have a PhD, right? So like I'm not like the best person to actually speak to this. This is purely my own hunch as to like why this happens and what the purpose of it ultimately is. And again, to go with the example of it where I was like, no, I think it's justifiable. I do think that was like so much of the project of surveillance capitalism that I was like, yep, I get it. I get why you had to do this, because she is also laying out like a philosophical argument in addition to a lot of the I don't know, researched components. So like that makes sense to me. And I think that is part of the project of this book too. To be clear, like I don't want to say that that's not part of what's happening here. I just think that sometimes that like academics will get too hung up on that and lose sight of like the point. And communication, and like having somebody understand you on the other end is like the actual goal of communicating a thing. And I don't know. that's a whole other sort of tangent, but
yeah, and this is the thing. I feel like I've been the more of these books we read, and this is not just like the social sciences book. This is just like in general nonfiction. I guess like what I've been appreciating more and more is how many of these books like will dedicate pages to telling you how they're going to tell you what they're going to tell you, and which is a thing that I totally understand. It's like this is not a criticism of it, but it's just like a thing that I'm starting to notice more and more, and I'm almost getting more and more critical about how they do that initial framing too, because I'm starting to realize like how much of that is not just like them walking you through a summarized view of their argument, but that sometimes the way that they lay that out is also like part of their argument. And like there were times in this book, I've got a tab of this. It's called Bad Science History.
Bad Science History tab. I love it.
Yeah. So she like this is like when she's like some of her initial framing of like science history, I found a lot of frustrating. I found it very frustrating in general. Like when she's talking about just kind of like how we talk about science in general. Like she has this sentence like, why has the world building work of fungi received so little appreciation? I wrote, from who? And then, but it is also because until quite recently, many people, especially scientists, especially scientists, imagined life as a matter of species by species. I don't know. There's all this stuff where it's like, you know this because of science. Like I like right. A lot of this framing of like, why didn't we talk about this? It's like, we're talking about this because scientists talked about it, like right. Like so I and then like there's this whole thing where I like this multiple sentences where she's like, mutualistic relations were interesting anomalies but not really necessary to understand life emerged from self-replication of each species, and I just like above each of these things just wrote like no and like and the thing is like I understand what she's saying, and so it's not like I'm disagreeing with the there are parts of the sentences I agree with, but then there are parts of the sentences that need to be changed to make it true, I think. Am I like reading? And like she acknowledges it later, like later as like, oh, okay, she actually is reevaluating this, but not in a way that actually like reevaluates this initial framing. She's just saying like, oh, but we changed. We didn't really change our understanding of this stuff that long ago, but like, yes, it was a big shift, but it's like, it's not that old. And like our understanding of like symbiosis, of endosymbiotic, like of like just like our understanding of life in general as the product of like relationships between different things is like relatively new, I guess you could argue, in science. But I also like, for me, reading this book just like had this like this initial question, and this is a thing that's coming up more and more for me with nonfiction, or just like how people frame arguments in general, where like there's sort of like this ambiguous we, and I always want to be like, who is the we? Like, who is the we who is saying, like, who is the we who is not appreciating fungi enough, or who is the we that is defining the world in terms of like individual species and not by their relationships? Like, there's like a very broad generalization there that I don't think is completely unfair, but I also like. It's hard for me because I'm like, I don't know, am I being just like a very nitpicky science person here? But I also just think like this framing is just like, for me, increasingly just like one that I'm like, this is not like a good way to set up your argument, to me at least, because I am immediately just like, no, like I just write no all over the page.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this, I think, with another kind of public education, maybe too. That yes, the similar also suffered from that as well. Just a lot of we's, where it was just like, okay, but who is we here? Yeah. Yes, like 100%. The thing that you were describing too. She also, there's like social science versions of this too. That where it's like there's a bit where she's talking about like, well, and now all the anthropologists will be like, you're just bowing to science, but here's why I'm not. And again, this is like a very common thing that I see in a lot of social science writing, but it is really frustrating because it's just like you are literally introducing an obvious straw man for why don't do it. And the other reason that I don't like it too is that it often just has like a kind of a condescending tone to it too. That's like, we always think this, but I have emerged to tell you this. Which like feels like a weird complaint to level against this book, because on the whole, like I do not find the style of this book condescending in general, to be clear. That's more like my complaint with that whole whatever weird straw manning of like the consensus is blah blah blah. But it's like obviously that it like who the consensus among who, and like I don't know, like if you're going to introduce this idea of this consensus of this we, that like then you're actually also going to need to like justify that to me as well. Like I'm going to need you to explain to me how and why that is the consensus, and like who and is the we in question. Yeah.
I like this comment from Colby about like how like it kind of stands out against like the way that she is actually like different, like within her argument itself, like she's saying like people are different, like there are like we are like different, we have different places we're coming from, all of that stuff. So like going from that specificity to then speaking so broadly, even if it's like this, like the thing is that like it's frustrating to us, but this is like not the substance of her argument. But like as the setup, as the framing for it, it is like super like distracting. It's like feels like it's not really part of her point, and then like it goes against the way that she has like done so well in talking about all of these other parts of her book and like all of these other parts of the world.
I also think too, I want to emphasize that like we're having this whole sort of sidebar conversation because this is book number 12. This is a year of nonfiction book club. That we've been doing this, right?
Woo-hoo.
And so like there's a little bit of at this point like because we have now spent so much time sitting with these books, sort of like going back and forth along from our like disciplines and whatever our backgrounds, and like getting this larger scope. There are ways in which I guess I want to emphasize that most of this conversation is not just like, oh, this like dragging this book. It's just like these are things that we are starting to notice. And like that's all. It's not these are not things that are like unique flaws even of this book. It's more just like it's interesting to me because I wonder how this conversation would have felt if this had been like the May 2020 book,
Totally. I mean, we already we referenced surveillance capitalism like multiple times, which has like become now my which I did not expect at the time, but it's become kind of like my definitive understanding social science writing kind of text, I think. Just because of like how it's written. I don't know if it is definitive. It just for me has like been like, oh, okay, that was the book where I was like, I think I almost understand what sociology is now. Like I sort of understand what you guys are doing, like broadly. I'm saying you guys.
Yeah, it's funny though because we've picked at least 3 other books that are for sure. So Shoshana Zuboff is not a sociologist. I can think of at least 3 books that I picked whose authors are sociologists. To be clear about that. So Ghosts in the Schoolyard by E. Ewing.
Oh right.
The Managed Heart by Arlie Hochschild, and Another Kind of Public Education by Patricia Hill Collins are the 3 that I can think of off the top of my head that are more correct examples, I guess.
That's true.
Sociology specifically, but sociology is not the totality of social science writing. So
true.
I don't know. This is a whole other. While we're talking about models of sociology writing, I just want to clarify that surveillance capitalism maybe not the one to single out.
But so I think what surveillance capitalism and also The Managed Heart, what they both really helped me understand was sort of the use of like the field or whatever, like the methodology is geared towards like observing things and then applying a framework around the things that are being observed. What was interesting to me about this book is that it's the opposite. It's the thing observed and then like using that to understand these other frameworks that like she is like kind of defining words and whatever, but like the real thing is like saying like starting out with a central point and then like moving outward, which was like a really different trajectory for like compared to the other books that I think we're talking about. So maybe like Ghosts in the Schoolyard.
But and it served the sort of dual, like the two, like the different spaces that this book is situated in. It served those really well too, like to approach it that way. Like here's a small object that I will use to explain frameworks rather than like frameworks to understand my object of study. Really, really interesting choice for trying to kind of move back and forth between the hard sciences and the social sciences.
Yeah. So I guess usually this is like roughly when we're like
Oh, yeah.
So How'd We Think?
Yeah.
And then if you guys want to, those of you watching, if you want to like ask us any questions or like offer more of your thoughts, or if there's something we didn't talk about with this book that you're curious about, whether or not you've read it, like just like things that you're like wondering about, you can ask us that now while we discuss.
That's Colby. That's a really good point. Deboki has asked me about this several times.
Yes.
I am not the one to answer this question. Like I actually almost DM'd. I have two of my friends who have PhDs in sociology and anthropology, respectively. Where I'm like it's my feeling on the difference between sociology and anthropology is very like I know it when I see it, but like to explain to you the difference is so hard for me. And that is actually a really good yes. Like the idea of like picking an object out. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
That's interesting. Cool. I do like the notion of you just setting your friends against each other and being like, which one of you is more valid? Like, which one of your fields?
I would have gone to be like, what would you say is the difference between sociology and anthropology? Like as people who are like invested in this in a way that like I haven't been in the sociology. I graduated from college in 2010. It's been over a decade since the last time I was in a sociology classroom. The stakes are non-existent for me. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely like less like the other thing that this. Oh no, I was gonna say it like felt less data-y and more story, but like I would say like the Managed Heart feels very story, like it feels like driven by like people's like personal experiences that she's like experiencing. Ooh, this is sorry, I got distracted by this. You go for it. You go for it first.
To that point, like I think that there's yes, like the Managed Heart did also have a lot of like story, but there is a greater effort to sort of like convert that experience into data points. I think like that to me is more how I think about it. Whereas like anthropology does tend to live much more on like ethnography and on like experiences that like that's the goal there is more about capturing experience in a way that like sociology does do it, but not it does still try harder to like move towards okay, how do we turn that into data points.
Got it. Yeah that I feel like was sort of like what Ghost in the Schoolyard did well too, of like combining the personal with the quantitative kind of methods in it.
Yes. Anyway, Overstory.
Yeah. So this book also made me think of the Overstory a lot, which it did not make me want to reread it because the Overstory was very long, and I have very like I have, if you want to watch, I have like a whole discussion video about the Overstory.
I've never and will never read the Overstory.
But yes, like the thing is like I know people who have like truly loved the Overstory, and I like totally buy it. If you're not familiar with it, I think the author is, I want to say, Richard Powers, yes. And it is about trees. Like the sum total of this book is just like it is about trees in America and like how we are destroying the forests. And like that is a lot of what this book was about. And I like totally kept thinking about the Overstory while I was reading about this book because it is so much about similar ideas. And like she has these moments of talking about like the economic forces behind logging versus like, you know, like the ecological stuff and all these things. And it like really felt like I was like reading this and I was like, I wonder if Richard Powers has read this book. Like this, and like I was just like, I feel like these books are in conversation with each other, but in a way where I was like, I like this book. Like it emphasized to me, for me, what was lacking from the Overstory, especially she talks a little bit about like indigenous practices with like the forest and like how like a lot of like the industrial forest ruins that we have today are like moving away from a lot of these like more like the practices that like shaped the forests in the US up to a certain point, and then like settler colonialism and then capitalism and like the logging and all of this good stuff, we like ruin the forest. And that is a big part of the Overstory, except that one of my big frustrations is that he like doesn't actually really like go into the history element. And like and this made me think more about the fact that like the non-white characters in that book, like if we're going to talk about like Asian American characters, are again coming from more of that like background that like I'm familiar with, but like in the context of this book I was like, all right, there are all these other like people involved, and he's kind of fixating on like a very narrow range of experiences and like for the scope of the book, whatever. I clearly have a lot of feelings. Maybe I have to do a part 2 discussion, except I don't want to reread the Overstory.
Yeah, you can just extrapolate this into your part 2 discussion without maybe watch your first one. Like watch your first video and then use that as your reference point. I like that like your head said these 2 books are in conversation, but your heart said, no, they're in a war and this book won.
Yes. Yeah. It really did. And like, okay, so like one of my big issues with the Overstory, aside from all the other stuff, is I just did not understand why it was a fiction book. I felt like it was like either a series of short stories about trees and like for some reason there were people in it, or it like would have been a really great set of essays. And this book for me was like, oh right, what I really wanted was like this book. Like I just turn it into like an actual study, you know? I don't need the fiction to sell me on reading trees. Maybe other people do, so that's the point of it. I don't know. That's why I'm like, very curious about what the point of the fiction was in the Overstory, but because I will never have a satisfactory answer to that, I'm glad that I at least had this book.
Maybe you should try to like collab with Miriam on your combined Overstory Mushroom at the End of the World
Yes.
project. I don't know what that would look like, but I would watch it. I would be interested in that content.
Yes. It's gonna like be like, why? Why? And I say this like, if you love the Overstory, I totally understand. I have friends who love the Overstory, and I think it really is a book that like does make you appreciate trees. Like I would read that book and then I would look outside and it'd be like, oh, my trees, they're so beautiful, right? Like I totally like felt that from the book. So I totally like 100% get why like people like really love that book. So like this is not to take away from that, but like this book also made me look at trees and be like, huh, or like look at the mushrooms in my fridge and I was like, huh, wonder how these fit into the fall of society thanks to capitalism. You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm
glad that I was not the only one who made the Overstory connection either, because I like definitely had that thought a lot while reading this. Was just like trees.
I'm also glad that we got to have this extended rant on the Overstory.
I'm always here for an Overstory rant. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, unless there are any other thoughts from the chat, last call. Would love to hear if you have any other thoughts and feelings on the mushroom at the end of the world while you are maybe typing those or maybe not. I don't know. Our next book next month on April 10th, we are reading The Lonely City, Adventures in the Art of Being Alone by Olivia Lang. I sort of hinted at the top that this is going to be a little bit of a different one. I have read some reviews about this that like the thing that disappointed people the most is that they did not expect the amount of art, that this book is talking about art a lot more than they were anticipating. So I am going to lead with that. So that nobody here is disappointed by why is she talking so much about art. But anyway, my understanding of this book is that it's sort of like it's a little bit memoir and also a little bit like, I don't know, like history of lonely artists, basically, and a beautiful meander of a book. I don't know. It's a little bit. It's a different vibe. This is definitely not like a social science book, but it is a nonfiction book. Hence, it qualifies as a nonfiction book club book. And as here in the U.S., we are all approaching our respective lockdown anniversaries. It's a great time to.
Can't imagine we'll have anything to talk about.
Yeah. It's a great time to just sit and think about this loneliness book. That's the plan. Also, last time we mentioned the possibility of a Discord, and I completely forgot about it until people also left comment in the chat, and people seemed mildly interested in it. So as we were starting this, I made it. We have one now. So if that's a thing that people would like to, oh, I have to paste it here, don't I? Okay, sure. I'm dropping it in the chat. I'm sure Devoki can also next Nonfiction Book Club Substack email.
Yeah.
If you want to come hang out. I still don't entirely know what the goal will be of this Discord, but it exists.
Yes.
If we want to chat while you're reading the thing, I'm on Discord literally always. So I'm sure I will be able to like jump in and participate in whatever conversations you want to have about The Lonely City or about any other nonfiction books that you're reading.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I included in the chat and have mentioned, we have a newsletter now, which is just basically for updates. So like if you have been wondering what our next book is, if you've been like looking for the link to our next live stream, we've just been posting it at the link in the thing. And so you can subscribe to it if you want to get it in your email. Otherwise, you can just check in on it when you want to. But it's useful for us because otherwise we're just like on our Twitters being like, hey, we are reading a book, but this way you don't have to look for those tweets.
Particularly last month, the one time that we we rescheduled too was like, how do we communicate? I don't know. We're just going to tweet about it, I guess. So, and then like, sure enough, we still have people being like, oh, I didn't realize it was next week. And I was like, well, I understand why you didn't realize that because we definitely told you something else.
That was on us.
So, yeah. So we're trying to be more communicative. That's the goal here.
Yes. Yeah.
That's it, I guess.
Great. Thank you guys for joining us. And we will see you guys on April 10th over on Nicole's channel to talk about The Lonely City.